The digestive system allows us to take in food and use it to fuel our life processes. There are four major functions of the digestive system. Ingestion is the intake of food. Digestion is the chemical and physical breakdown of food. Absorption is picking up the nutrients and putting them in the bloodstream. And elimination gets rid of anything that's left over that was undigested. There are two main parts to the digestive system: the alimentary canal, or the tube that goes through our body, and the accessory digestive organs that are outside the tube but assist us with the digestive processes. The alimentary canal is also known as the gastrointestinal tract or the GI tract. It is a continuous hollow muscular tube that extends from mouth to anus. It includes the mouth, the pharynx, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and the large intestine. The construction of the alimentary canal or the GI tract is the same pretty much from esophagus to large intestine. There is an inner lining that is known as the mucosa. This is a moist lining. It secretes mucus, and the mucus helps things slide through with less friction. The submucosa is where the glands are located. Blood vessels, nerves, and the lymphatics are in this area. Then we have the muscularis externa. This is a double muscle layer. One layer goes around and the other layer goes longitudinally, and this is smooth muscle. And the serosa is the outer layer. This is connective tissue. The connective tissue that lines the abdominal cavity and also covers all of the organs in the abdominal cavity is known as the peritoneum. And the peritoneum is what makes up the serosa. The mouth is known as the oral cavity. This is where ingestion occurs. The pharynx, you'll remember, is a passageway for both food and air. Deglutition occurs in the pharynx. This is the act of swallowing. The esophagus is part of the digestive system only. It's a passageway for food and connects to the stomach. The stomach is really just a C-shaped holding tank. It has a gastroesophageal sphincter. This is a circular muscle that's here at the top of the stomach. And then we have the pyloric sphincter that is the doorway to the small intestine. There are gastric glands in the stomach that secrete the gastric juice, which is acidic, and some enzymes that help start to break down protein. Gastritis is an inflammation of the stomach lining. This can be caused by bacteria, viruses, or just irritating foods. The heavy mucus that's produced by the stomach lining helps protect the stomach from the strong acid that's produced. As food enters the stomach, it stimulates the release of gastric juice, the hydrochloric acid, and the pepsin. Pepsin is the enzyme that starts to break down protein. Heartburn occurs when gastric juice backs up into the esophagus. The esophagus doesn't have that strong mucus protection, and so the acid literally burns the esophagus. The hydrochloric acid that's secreted by the stomach helps keep the pH low, and the mucus protects the walls of the stomach from the acid. We need an acid environment in the stomach because pepsin is only active at a very low pH. Stomach ulcers sometimes occur if the acid digests the stomach. This typically starts with an infection with a bacteria known as Helicobacter pylori. Vomiting or emesis occurs if there's an irritation or overstretching which activates the emetic center in the medulla oblongata. The muscles of the stomach will contract and increase the pressure, forcing material out through the mouth instead of allowing it to continue on through the digestive system. The small intestine starts at the pyloric sphincter and goes to the ileocecal valve or the ileocecal sphincter. This is the opening to the large intestine. This is the longest part of the gastrointestinal tract and has three subdivisions. The first foot or so is the duodenum, and then we have 10 or 12 feet of jejunum and another 10 or 12 feet of ileum. The wall of the small intestine has villi on it, and the villi have other little projections called microvilli. This increases the surface area so that this is a very absorptive part of the system. Also, scattered throughout the small intestine will be malt tissue, the Peyer's patches. These lymphatic patches will help kill any bacteria that may try to enter the body through the intestinal wall. Once the food gets here, it has been so mechanically broken down and so chemically broken down that it's about the consistency of a milkshake. We call it chyme. The small intestine also secretes protective mucus. It's not quite as heavy as the stomach. The stomach acid is somewhat neutralized by some of the secretions that enter the small intestine. There are brush border enzymes that are produced by the cells that line the small intestine. These break down proteins and sugars. Pancreatic juices are also added to the duodenum. This is part of what neutralizes the pH of the stomach acid, and pancreatic juice will carry enzymes that will break down proteins, carbohydrates, and fats. Bile is added to the duodenum. This is produced in the liver. Bile helps break fats up into smaller droplets so that the enzymes from the pancreas have a better chance to break them down. The villi provide an increased surface area so that as we begin breaking down the large nutrients to smaller subunits that can be absorbed, we have a good absorptive area. There is an excellent blood and lymphatic flow inside each of the villi. Here you see the lining of the small intestine, and these projections are the villi. You can see how there would be a lot more absorptive area here. Notice that each villus has its own blood supply and its own lymphatic supply. Each of these cells have individual microvilli on their surface. These are the brush border cells, so these are the cells that produce the brush border enzymes that do the final chemical digestion. The large intestine is larger in diameter than the small intestine and shorter, only about 3 feet long or so. This goes from ileocecal valve to the anus. Most of what happens in the large intestine is the absorption of water. This helps dry out the indigestible food that's made it this far. There are 5 subdivisions to the large intestine. The cecum is a little blind pouch that hangs down below where the small intestine enters. Attached to the cecum is the appendix. Then we have the colon, and the colon is divided into 3 pieces, the ascending, the transverse, and the descending colon. Then we have the rectum and the anal canal. There are no villi in the large intestine, but there are a large number of goblet cells. These are going to produce mucus. As we dry out the indigestible food products, we need a lot of lubrication so that moves smoothly through the large intestine. Here you see the large intestine. Here is where the ileum is attaching to the large intestine, so this would be the ileocecal valve. This little bit of the large intestine that's below that is the cecum, and the appendix hangs off the cecum. Then we have the ascending, transverse, and descending colon. The sigmoid colon will take the colon back to the posterior part of the body where it can attach to the rectum and the anal canal. The large intestine receives water and any undigested material. The bacteria that live here will sometimes break down that undigested material and produce gases. They also give the feces the odor. Absorption here is limited pretty much to water, vitamins, and ions. About 3 to 4 times a day there are mass movements. That is, there's broad peristaltic movement that moves material through the large intestine. These mass movements move the undigested material toward the rectum for elimination. Some of the imbalances that occur in the large intestine are things like diarrhea. Here, peristaltic activity is too fast. Food rushes through the large intestine and we don't have enough time to absorb the water. So material is rushing through quickly and it's going to come out very watery. Constipation is the other problem. Things stay in the large intestine too long and too much water is absorbed. This can happen if there's a lack of fiber in the diet or if there's not very much exercise. Movement of the large intestine occurs a little bit on you moving. Fiber or bulk in the diet also increases the strength of the contractions and softens the stool. Diverticulitis occurs when people have constipation or have problems moving material out of the large intestine. As they strain to have a bowel movement, they will kind of herniate the large intestine wall, and we get these little pouches that form. These are called diverticuli. Having diverticuli is the condition known as diverticulosis. If the diverticuli become inflamed, then you have diverticulitis. This is when the pouches get filled and they get infected. These pouches can rupture when they're infected, and that would mean intestinal contents would get into the peritoneal cavity. Appendicitis occurs when the inflammation is in the appendix. The appendix is surgically removed by a procedure known as an appendectomy. The appendix can swell to the point that it ruptures, and just like with diverticulitis, if we have a rupture in the large intestine area, intestinal contents will spill into the peritoneum. This will cause peritonitis. Peritonitis is when the peritoneum becomes inflamed. This is the lining of the abdominal cavity. This has to be treated with high-dose antibiotics because there's a wide variety of bacteria that live in the large intestine. Peritonitis can be a life-threatening problem. The accessory digestive organs include things like the salivary glands. The salivary glands produce saliva. Saliva is mucus and water and salivary amylase. Amylase begins the breakdown of carbohydrates. There are also lysozymes and antibodies in the saliva that help keep the mouth bacteria at an acceptable level. Saliva helps moisten the food and starts the breakdown of the food. As we get that lump of wet food, we call it a bolus. Mumps is a viral infection that infects the salivary glands, particularly the parotid salivary glands. Mumps is typically a childhood disease. Most people are vaccinated with the MMR to protect them from mumps. Mumps in children usually does not cause a major problem. However, mumps in an adolescent male or an adult male can cause sterility. The teeth are also part of the accessory digestive organs. The teeth masticate or chew the food. They grind it up into finer pieces. This is part of mechanical digestion. Children have 20 deciduous teeth or baby teeth. These are designed to fall out and be replaced by the permanent teeth, and they're usually 32 in the adult. The pancreas is associated with the small intestine. It produces pancreatic enzymes for chemical digestion of food. These are secreted directly into the duodenum. Also, the pancreatic fluid is somewhat alkaline, so it neutralizes the acidic chyme that's coming from the stomach. The liver does a number of things, but in terms of digestion, it produces bile. Bile emulsifies fats. By emulsifying fats, we take a big glob of fat and we break it down into a lot of little globs. Bile enters the alimentary canal in the duodenum. The liver is always producing bile, but we only put bile in the duodenum when we have food there. Excess bile is stored in the gallbladder. The gallbladder then stores bile when we're not actively digesting fats. When we need the bile, the gallbladder contracts and that releases the bile. This occurs when chyme enters the duodenum. The relationship of the liver, the pancreas, and the gallbladder are seen here. The pancreas is very close to the duodenum, and it produces its pancreatic enzymes and fluids that enter the duodenum here. The liver produces the bile, and there is a direct duct into the small intestine, but there's also a backup duct. So if we have this sphincter muscle right here closed, then the bile backs up and is stored in the gallbladder. The gallbladder can then contract when we need it and send the bile into the duodenum. There are 6 digestive processes: ingestion, propulsion, mechanical digestion, chemical digestion, absorption, and defecation. Ingestion is putting food in your mouth, chewing it up. Saliva release is reflexive. Thinking of food, seeing food, and putting food in your mouth causes you to release saliva. Deglutition or swallowing is voluntary. After you've chewed for a while, you make a conscious decision to use your tongue to force the bolus back into your pharynx. Once we get in the pharynx, propulsion starts. This is from pharynx to anus. Peristalsis are involuntary waves of contraction in those smooth muscles that are in the walls of the alimentary canal. These smooth muscle contractions move material through the tube. Segmentation occurs in certain areas. Segmentation is when the smooth muscle takes turns contracting and relaxing, so that as we begin to do this contraction, different contraction, this contraction, different contraction, we eventually mix all of the material up. This is how we make sure that enzymes that are digesting the food thoroughly get to all of the food. Mechanical digestion is the mechanical breakdown of the food we take in. This is the mixing that we do with the tongue, the chewing we do with the teeth, and then the segmentation that occurs along the digestive system. Chemical digestion is breaking down the large molecules using enzymes. The macromolecules, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, are broken down to their building blocks or their monomers, glucose, amino acids, and fatty acids. These are the only molecules that can be absorbed. Absorption is the transport of digested products into the blood or the lymph. Glucose and amino acids are absorbed into the blood. Fats are absorbed into the lymph. The small intestine is where most of the absorption occurs. Defecation is the elimination of any of the material that couldn't be digested. This is a function of the large intestine. Cholecystitis is an inflammation of the gallbladder. If bile is stored for too long in the gallbladder, water is reabsorbed from it. This will make the bile salts crystallize. The bile salts will have sharp points on them. When the gallbladder contracts to release bile, it causes pain. Gallstones are the usual cause for cholecystitis. Sometimes an infection can cause it, but typically it's gallstones. Jaundice occurs when the bile that's supposed to be cleared by the liver backs up in the bloodstream. This makes the skin yellow in color. This is what jaundice is. This is typically due to a blockage of the hepatic or the bile ducts. The bile cannot get into the small intestine, and so it ends up in the blood. Jaundice is usually an indication of either hepatitis or cirrhosis of the liver. Cleft palate or cleft lip occurs when the bones of the skull that make up the roof of the mouth do not fuse properly. This interferes with feeding. The child can't suck on a bottle or on the nipple. The food also tends to end up in the nose as well as in the mouth, making it very hard for the child to breathe while eating. This is corrected surgically. Usually there are several surgeries over several years. A tracheoesophageal fistula occurs if there is a connection between the esophagus and the trachea. These two tubes are supposed to be separate and distinct, but sometimes they don't completely separate during development. This is corrected with surgery. As the baby takes in food, even though the epiglottis is working just fine, as the food goes down the esophagus, it can get over into the trachea, so the food ends up in the respiratory system and the child can't breathe. This is corrected with surgery. Cystic fibrosis we discussed in the respiratory system. This is a genetic problem. The primary effect is in the lungs from that excessive sticky mucus. The mucus also blocks the pancreatic duct and prevents pancreatic fluid from reaching the small intestine. Eventually, the pancreas is damaged from this backup. We can administer pancreatic enzymes with every meal so that the digestive process can continue appropriately. Phenylketonuria is another congenital defect. The tissues can't use the amino acid phenylalanine, which is found in protein. Milk protein contains phenylalanine. When the phenylalanine can't be used, it becomes phenylketone. Phenylketone will damage brain tissue. So these children can be mentally retarded if they're not placed on a special diet. Usually, as they reach adulthood, they no longer have to be on the special diet, but women, when they become pregnant, go back on the special diet. If you look at the labels of certain foods, you sometimes see warnings that say this contains phenylalanine. This is so people who are on the special diet will know that they cannot use that product. A nutrient is a substance that promotes normal growth, maintenance of the body, or repair of the body. Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, vitamins, minerals, and water are all considered nutrients. Vitamins are organic materials, that means they contain both carbon and hydrogen, and minerals are inorganic things like sodium or chloride or magnesium. Metabolism is simply all of the chemical reactions needed for life. There are two processes that make up metabolism. Catabolism is the breakdown of material. Mostly carbohydrates are used to fuel our metabolism. Anytime we break down molecules, we're going to release energy, and we can use that energy to make ATP. ATP is the energy our cells can use for their processes. The other part of metabolism is anabolism. This is building new materials. We constantly have to build materials to replace things that wear out in our cells. Whenever we're building new materials, we're going to require energy. So metabolism is really the formation and use of energy using nutrients to make the energy. Most of our metabolism is based on using carbohydrates. Glucose, or blood sugar, is the product of carbohydrate digestion. There are 3 steps involved in breaking down glucose to form ATP. We have glycolysis, which is breaking glucose down to a 3-carbon substance known as pyruvic acid. Then we have the Krebs cycle, and this is how we break down carbon some more. The electron transport chain is where we make most of the ATP. Materials that are made in glycolysis and in the Krebs cycle go into the electron transport chain so that we can make ATP. Glycolysis occurs in the cytoplasm, and everything else occurs in the mitochondria. One glucose molecule will yield approximately 36 ATP molecules. With lipid metabolism, fats are broken down into fatty acids, and fatty acids can be directly used to make ATP. Other uses of lipid breakdown is to make products like the myelin sheaths around the nerves, cholesterol, and cell membranes. In order for proteins to be used by the body, they have to be broken down to their amino acids. Usually amino acids are conserved because we primarily use protein in anabolism. We use the amino acids to make new proteins. In order to make a new protein, we need all 20 amino acids. 9 of these are what we call essential amino acids. We have to take them in preformed in our diet. The other 11 we can manufacture from carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, and nitrogen. It's important that we have all 20 amino acids because the body will not make a new protein unless all of the amino acids required to make that protein are available. Proteins are not a very good source of manufacturing ATP. Protein metabolism to make ATP is used only when we have an abundant amount of protein in the diet or during starvation when we really don't have carbohydrates or fats to break down. This shows how the 3 major nutrients are used by the body. Carbohydrates are our primary source of making ATP, but fats can be broken down and can enter this process at various places. Proteins are primarily used to make new proteins. Amino acids going back and forth between proteins we ingest and proteins we need. But if there are abundant proteins in the diet, or if there are no carbohydrates or fats, we do have mechanisms for taking the amino acids and entering into the system that makes ATP. The liver plays an important role in maintaining blood levels of all of our nutrients, but particularly glucose. The liver maintains blood glucose levels through 3 mechanisms. Glycogenesis is when we have excessive glucose in the body and we store the glucose as glycogen. You'll remember that the hepatic portal system takes blood from the digestive system and circulates it through the liver. This is so the liver can take a look at that blood. If there's lots of glucose in it, it will let some of the glucose go on out, but the rest of it will store as glycogen. Glycogenolysis occurs when the liver breaks down glycogen to release glucose. If the blood coming from the digestive system to the liver is nutrient poor, this is when glycogenolysis will occur. And gluconeogenesis is when the liver makes glucose from non-carbohydrate substances like fats or proteins. The brain can only use glucose, so we always have to have some glucose in the blood. The liver protects the brain by always making sure that there is some glucose available, either through glycogenolysis or gluconeogenesis. The liver also plays an important role in the metabolism of cholesterol. Cholesterol is a lipid. 15% of the cholesterol circulating in your blood is from your diet. The other 85% is made by your liver. We need cholesterol to make cell membranes, to make vitamin D, and to make the steroid hormones. The steroid hormone cortisol is necessary to maintain life. Fats are not water soluble. If we're going to transport fats in the blood, we have to do something to make them soluble. In the case of cholesterol, we attach them to proteins. These are lipoproteins. The lipoproteins are also made by the liver. Low-density lipoproteins, or LDLs, transport cholesterol and lipids to the tissues. The LDLs primarily take material to the adipose tissue. If we have more lipids than the adipose tissue or the other tissues can use, the LDLs can stick to the artery walls and form plaques. HDL are the high-density lipoproteins. These transport cholesterol and lipids from the tissues back to the liver for breakdown and excretion in the bile. LDLs are what we call the lousy lipoproteins, and HDL are the happy lipoproteins. We don't want a lot of LDL, we do want a lot of HDL. That's the good kind of cholesterol. Your basal metabolic rate, or BMR, is all of the energy you need to sustain essential life functions at rest. This is the energy you need for breathing, heartbeat, kidney function, those things that go on whether you're aware of them or not. We measure energy in kilocalories. On food, you see this as a calorie. A calorie is really a measure of the amount of heat that food will produce. Since food produces heat, it contributes to our body temperature. Heat is the byproduct of metabolism. The body relies on this heat to help maintain a proper body temperature. The thermostat for the body resides in the hypothalamus, so the hypothalamus is what balances our body temperature. There are 2 mechanisms that help maintain homeostasis of body temperature. One is our heat-promoting mechanisms. If we're cold, we do everything we can to conserve body heat. We have vasoconstriction, so the blood is kept deep in the body near vital organs. This is why people turn pale when they're cold. That blood is not at the surface of the skin. Also, muscle contraction generates heat, so shivering can generate heat. Most people, if they're cold, also flap their arms or stamp their feet or hunch up so that they kind kind of protect their body heat. Heat loss mechanisms come into play when the body is too warm. Radiation allows heat to move away from the body. Vasodilation will bring warm blood to the capillary beds in the skin, and that heat can radiate away from our body. Also, we sweat. As the sweat evaporates, that cools us down a little bit. If we get too cold, we can have frostbite. Here the cells die from lack of oxygen and nutrients. The blood vessels close off to conserve heat. Also, the fluid in the cells may freeze, and ice crystals have sharp points on them that can damage the cells. Hypothermia occurs if the temperature is too cold in the body for too long. We can't maintain metabolic reactions. Hypothermia can cause death. If we get too hot, we can experience heat exhaustion. Now, during physical activity, you're going to sweat a lot, and that sweat is going to dehydrate you. Some of that fluid will come out of your blood, and you will have low blood pressure. So with heat exhaustion, people collapse. They need to cool off, and they need to replace their fluids. If they don't cool off, you can get hyperthermia. The high body temperatures increase metabolic reactions. This further increases body temperature. This is when you can have heat stroke, and heat stroke can lead to brain damage and death.